Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensies. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. In this episode, I'm joined by Texas A&M philosophy PhD student Jared Oliphint, I believe, to talk about some of the cool stuff that he's been working on in the philosophy of language. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Jared, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Hey, thanks for having me, Parker. Good to be with you.
It's Oliphint, right?
That's it. Yep, you
Oliphint.
Got it.
Okay.
I mean,
I always want to say
all kinds of pronunciations, but that's the one that we do ourselves.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. And some of my guests or some of my listeners will know immediately that name from Dr. K. Scott Oliphint, who is your father, correct?
That's right. Yep, that's
right.
it.
And he's been at Westminster for a while, and all of us Vantillians are really indebted to him for all of his notes and all the books and everything like that. So this is fun because you're not following in the theology steps, you're following in philosophy. So I just wanted to ask you, man, how'd you get into philosophy?
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's kind of two answers to this, but one is, my freshman year, in college, I took a philosophy course, and it was like this. It was almost like a mini course. I think they did like a quad course, like half a semester,
Mm-hmm.
and it was on great traditions in ethics, and it was taught by a guy named Spire. Basically, he was a student at Westminster, and he kind of followed in Van Til's footsteps. And I didn't know much of his background at the time, but he started, lecturing and presenting this kind of material, and I just fell in love with thinking about things deeply, thinking about big ideas. And I mean, I truly didn't know what philosophy was until that point. And he starts talking and describes what the course is going to be about. And I thought we were getting away with something. I didn't know that there was a discipline where you could kind of write about stuff that you're interested in and think about big ideas. The second part of that answer is I'd always just sort of thought that way. I wondered about things, and I was curious about things. And so, yeah, being in this class made me think, okay, well, this is a discipline that I want to pursue a little bit more. I don't know what's going on here, but I like wondering about things and being curious about things and thinking deeply, those sorts of things. So, yeah, I ended up being a philosophy major. I entered college wanting to be like a computer science major or something, just because I thought there would be some jobs at the end of it. But that didn't work out too well. So philosophy is a thing that I chose.
You went from a field that has a lot of jobs to a field where there's not a whole lot of jobs there available.
Yeah, no one was telling me that at the time, and it was the job market was a little bit better back then. Right now, especially with COVID, it's completely horrendous.
Right.
But yeah, I maybe thankfully no one told me that at the time, because I don't know if I would have been steered differently.
Yeah. So you did your undergrad in philosophy, and then if I'm not mistaken, you did go to Westminster, and you got your MDiv there. Is that right?
I started out in the MDiv program. Yeah, I went right from graduating college to like 2 months later doing summer Greek, and right into the MDiv program that changed to the MAR as I got more into studies, Master of Arts in Religion. And so that's what I graduated with. And yeah, and then yeah, I don't need to go into the rest of the deal, but that basically just entered the normal job market after that. Because I went straight into seminary, I was a little bit burned out on academics and just needed to step back a little bit from that whole world. So it took a little bit of a break.
Yeah. Well, can you help me out with the MAR? Is that like an apologetics degree, or what's that like?
Yeah, I mean, good question. It depends on the seminary. They, a lot of seminaries do it differently. The way that Westminster did it was sort of like a truncated version of the MDiv. It didn't have the pastoral elements. I never had any inclinations towards the pastor. I always knew that I wanted to like teach and go into academics on some level, but I really wanted the theological groundwork. And so that's part of the reason why I went to Westminster. But the MAR takes care of a lot of the, systematic theological. There are different tracks, right? There's biblical studies, there's systematic theological, and I was more on like the apologetic systematic theological track. So I didn't need to do like preaching classes and stuff like that.
That's great. Yeah, I'm doing the same here at TED's, and everyone's like, "Are you doing an MDiv?" I'm like, "I don't really want to be a pastor, man. I don't want to preach or anything." And I always get crap for that here, but yeah, that's cool to see. There's I'm in good company here.
Yeah.
But so that brings us to your current studies, and you're at Texas A&M, and you're
Yeah.
studying philosophy of language, right? And so I think well, actually, you explained to me. Are you studying philosophy of language? Is that what you would say to people?
It's kind of a hybrid. It's
Okay.
at least what I'm looking at right now is it's the metaphysics of language,
Ah,
and so it there, we'll see what happens. But I envision right now having two AOSs, areas of specialization,
mm,
one being in metaphysics and the other being in philosophy of language. Because that, yeah, so I'm using the idea is to use a lot of the metaphysical tools in analytic philosophy and apply them to what language is and the different parts of language and the different objects and entities that compose language.
okay, that makes sense. Well, that brings me to another question. Just the relation between philosophy of language and the other sub-disciplines. Um,
Yeah.
People usually think when you think big picture about philosophy, you got epistemology, metaphysics, and value theory, or aesthetics, whatever. Axiology, value theory, axiology. Does philosophy of language neatly fit in one of those, or is it its own discipline? Because I know there's a lot of overlap, and like you said, you're doing metaphysics of language here.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. I mean, I'll answer it this way and see
Yeah,
if I'm actually answering your question. But it's it's a very live discipline. I mean, it's kind of, how should I even put it? I don't want it to sound too foundational, but in a sense, it is sort of foundational to analytic philosophy
yeah,
because of just the history and how analytic philosophy started. I mean, with the
right,
linguistic turn in the late 19th, early 20th century, and the focus on language and formal languages, and just the explosion of the relationship between like mathematics and logic
yeah,
that happened within the 20th century, and the emphasis on being like extremely precise in conceptual analysis, then methodologically you're going to have a lot of linguistic issues that come into play for whatever discipline you're getting into, whether that be epistemology, metaphysics, value theory, philosophy of science, those sorts of things.
yeah,
So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely in the mix there with all those other sort of historically important
yeah.
yeah, other fields.
Yeah, that helps. So when I first started studying philosophy, it was because of apologetics. I got in through some Van Til and realized I need some theology, then realized I need some philosophy as well. And I started, I inherited like a lot of begrudging of philosophy of language. And you read
Yeah.
some apologetics books, and I don't think you can write an apologetics book today without kicking around the logical positivists. Like you just have to.
Right.
Everyone's got a little bit on that. You got to quote C.S. Lewis, and you got to kick around the positivists. And so I kind of inherited that, like, that's where philosophy went wrong, to turn to language. And then now I'm kind of coming full circle and realizing, like you said, how foundational it is, and historically, but actually, practically, we're talking right now with language. We wouldn't be able to we wouldn't be able to pick out the aspect that we want without language, and it's huge. God created the world with language, and so I kind of come full circle on that. But I wonder, how did you get into the metaphysics of language? Like, why did that draw your attention?
Yeah, I think, biographically, it was something like this. I'm still trying to piece that together. I mean, I
Yeah.
look back and I go, what was the thinking there? Because I entered the program really wanting to focus on abstract objects.
Hmm.
And what are they? What are they like? And I mean, when I entered the program, I look at myself then, and I didn't know jack about jack. I there was this idea where like I was going, oh, this is an interesting question. Like, what are abstract objects? And then come to find out, extremely brilliant people have been thinking about this for decades and decades, and in ways that really are accelerated beyond where I'm at right now. It's
Hmm.
certainly where I started in the program. But to answer your question, I think what it was I was interested in abstract objects, and so I took a little bit of a look at the literature, like what are people saying? Let me get some basic ideas down on what's going on in the debates. And there were a lot of discussions surrounding, do they exist or not? And a lot of there were many different approaches, which I don't need to go into. There's fictionalism about abstract objects and those sorts of views that want to say, okay, maybe there's something going on, but they don't exist in the same way that we think, tables and chairs exist or something like that. And sometimes I would hear something like this. It would be, okay, well, this is, we talk about properties, we talk about other abstract objects, numbers, and it's just a way of speaking. Yeah. And I thought, okay, to me, that didn't seem like much of an answer or a satisfying answer. I wanted to go, well, then what's speaking? Like, it sort of assumes that a way of speaking is maybe nominalistically acceptable, and that's a. So I'm paraphrasing. There aren't philosophically sophisticated arguments that just boil down to that sort of approach. Right. But again, just talking loosely, that's kind of a way that some people want to get around the existence of abstract objects is just to say, well, it's metaphorical. We're just kind of speaking this way, and it's not really referring to any actual entities. And I think that's how I got into the metaphysics of language, is to go, okay, but what is language then? Can we make language itself either physicalist or what's the ontology of language? What's the best account metaphysically for what language is in all its parts?
Yeah, man, it's so interesting. And for the listeners, who it might sound pedantic at first, and if you get into like Russell's theories, and you get into the reference and all that, it's like, dude, Russell wrote like 3 chapters on the word the, and it's like, right, what this is crazy. And then you actually get into it and you're like, wow, this is crazy. And then you see what we're doing right now is a really crazy thing, using words and meaning and understanding each other and talking about the world. It's crazy. I really like that.
Absolutely.
And so you work on the ontology of language. Are you also working on the ethics? Are you pursuing that as well?
Yeah, the hope is and this will be a little bit later this semester, I hope, okay, where I take some of the framework and observations that I've made on the ontological and metaphysical questions, and then go, okay, so what's going on with some of the ethical issues involved in language? Because it's especially relevant today because there are a lot of issues surrounding freedom of speech, language, a lot of issues surrounding like what is hate speech, what's going. So you have language, and then you have sort of this extra layer of ethics involved, and these other elements that are involved in linguistic objects, hate or kindness, or a lot of those elements, really charged words surrounding what language is. And so the hope is to figure out what's going on there in relation to the metaphysics that I've already done. And that might be a loose connection. You can see I haven't totally worked that out yet, but I think I'm at least interested in the question. So things like honesty, that is related to truth and expression, those are the kinds of things that I'm going to be looking at, hopefully.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. Do you think that understanding the ontology will help us get clear on the ethics of language, or can they come apart easily enough?
That's a good question. That's an unknown for me right now. Okay. I just haven't pursued it enough. I mean, I think again so recognizing like the limits of what you can do when you study the metaphysics of language, I think the best you can do is it provides like a framework. Okay. It provides you with some sort of framework that says, when I am referring to different kinds of objects, what are the characteristics of those objects in language that I'm referring to? How can we get more precise and clear on those sorts of things? That's really like the step one goal. Okay. Yeah.
That's awesome. Can you help us? Can you fill it? So for me, I didn't like philosophy of language. I thought that I kind of picked up that trope from apologists, and it was my own fault as well. But now coming back around, seeing how interesting it is, seeing how cool everything in the philosophy of language is, it's interesting to see that this is still such a like burgeoning field, because this is where it started. and yet there's still all this work going on. Can you fill us in just on a couple things that are going on lately in the philosophy of language?
Yeah, let's see. Boy, that's a great question. So as I look at journals in my limited capacity,
Yeah,
one area of research, and if you ask me a lot of follow-up questions on this, I'm not going to be able to answer it because I haven't been able
yeah,
to dive
I won't.
pretty deeply into it. But one area that has received a decent amount of attention is conceptual engineering.
Hmm.
And the issues involved in that, again, I'm not able right now because I haven't really studied it much.
Yeah.
But like there was a recent article by David Chalmers where he wanted to conceptually engineer the concept of conceptual engineering. So he has like this meta level of like what's going on with conceptual, like, what do we mean by that, what sorts of things does it refer to, how do we in one sense like improve our language so that it's either more accurate or reflects the intuitive ideas that we want when we express something. And so yeah, that's a very simplistic answer to your question. Is there's a lot of articles being written about that recently,
Yeah.
the details of which are still a little foggy in my mind. I don't know if I'll get into it that much, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah. I think when we talked before, you might have said something about slurs, about how a lot of people are working on slurs. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, I mean, pejoratives are popular, partially because it's so applicable to the political situation, the social media online situation, and it's just, when you're talking about, uh, the ethics and harms in that way, people usually have some sort of personal connection to that. I can remember when, something negative was said about me,
Hmm.
and certain words were used. So yeah, that's a field. Again, that's not something that I've personally gone into, but it's still a live, I guess, debate or discussion that's going on right now within the philosophy of language. Like, how do you apply philosophy of language principles to this certain class of expressions?
Yeah. That's so interesting to me because, like you said, it pops up in politics a lot. But even maybe a year or two ago, some journalist was talking about how truckers are going to be out of work soon with automated truck driving and stuff like that. And
Oh,
they said like, "Oh, learn to code," and then everyone turned that against the journalists, and we're like, "Well, when journalists go out, just learn to code." And then one journalist said like that's like a slur to us, that's like should be hate speech, and just being like, what are we talking about here? I think that's
what
so
part was
applicable.
a pejorative?
What's that?
What part of that expression was the pejorative?
Learn to code, I guess, was like
Huh.
they said that whole sentence, that phrase was like, I think they said it was like the N-word, and everyone's like, dude, no, it's not. You don't get to say that. So I think that's so interesting looking at the philosophy of it instead of just the emotional response. And looking
Yeah.
why do we have this emotional response? Not that emotions are bad, but why? Is it right? Is it wrong? How do we think through? Yeah, philosophy of
Yeah.
language. It's all there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really. I mean, that's the hook that gets you into the topic, and then right, thinking about the issues a little bit more deeply than sort of like a knee-jerk emotional reaction is
Yeah.
the value of taking some of those tools and saying, let's get specific on what you mean. Is that a good argument that you can compare
Yeah.
those couple things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just real quick here. Maybe could you help us? I know there's going to be a lot of overlap. Can you help us think through like a difference between like a linguist and a philosopher of language? Do you have a clear conception of that?
Yeah, let me see if I can take a stab at it. I mean, there's overlap for sure.
Hmm.
The area of linguistics, again, I'm not a specialist in the area of linguistics, but from what I can tell from the literature that does overlap, linguistics is much more squarely in the scientific realm. And so it's
Okay.
studying what actually does go on with language, the syntax, the semantics, comparative analysis between different languages, and then intra-language comparison as well. So I'm sure, different kinds of like dialects, what's going
Mm.
on there with English. And a lot of that data for philosophers of language is used to think about categories and other questions involving like reference theory or even conceptual engineering or something like that.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be a little bit more broader than just looking at the data of like how do people use this phrase, that word, comparing it to other languages, that sort of thing. So yeah, linguistics is much more in the scientific realm. Philosophy of language, while it definitely veers into that territory a decent amount, it's going to be backing up a little bit, looking at big picture questions.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so I wanted to jump in on some of your work, some of the things that you've been working on, you've been talking to me about, which has been really helpful. And I think it's funny because, again, going back to the logical positivists, they wanted to, nix all metaphysics, and here you are working on the metaphysics of language. Their pride and joy. So I think that's funny. But I wanted to go over this problem in philosophy of language, and we talked about it on the podcast. I did an episode on the problem of definition. And it's kind of old. It's like going over Mortimer Adler's work and like the ancient problem of defining things. And in my reading of that, I found realists, nominalists, and then pragmatists as well. So like a realist said that we can define things by their essence, and a nominalist says we define things in name only, and then a pragmatist says we just define things for our own uses. And so I wanted to get into what you've talked about with linguistic entities and like the metaphysics of that. I wonder, are there still these three kind of categories? Are there still pragmatists out there, or is it really just between realists and nominalists? Is that the debate today?
Yeah, good question. Let's see if I can sort that out. I mean, in approaches to metaphysics in general, the realist nominalist debate is still live.
Okay.
And then on the other side, on the philosophy of language side, pragmatics is a very live, ongoing field within philosophy of language that studies how language is being used, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And then there are positions within pragmatic discussions of, is a realist or a nominalist. So that's how I would kind of frame those different categories. So I'm not, I don't know if that tracks with what you've been looking at.
I think it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's all I'll say on the categorization, but so what am I missing?
Well, I think that's good. So just following up on that, I want to talk about linguistic entities and what they are, but I think we got to talk about properties probably first. Are all linguistic entities properties?
No. So yeah, good question. So okay. So first, let me back up. I forgot to mention this. So on definition, at least one of the dominant ways to define things within analytic philosophy is to give necessary and sufficient conditions for whatever term you're defining. And that's notoriously extremely difficult for just about anything.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of papers that I read that start off and go, here's what I'm talking about. I can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for this, but let me try to get at this idea this way. That's a very common way, because it's recognized that giving that sort of precise definition for something is just really difficult.
You take the whole paper probably, right?
Yeah, or it would just, yeah, maybe, but really the primary problem is coming up with counterexamples. If you say there's a necessary and sufficient condition for X, then it's very easy for someone to come along and say, well, what about this over here? And that goes for a lot of different things. So I'm generalizing, but that's the state of defining things in analytic philosophy. It's just really difficult to do.
Is that stipulative? Is that just we're just sticking with stipulative definitions? Here's what I mean by this, or are you saying it's even less than that? Just saying, let's talk about this thing. Don't push me on that.
It's broader, I think, than that. I mean, if the comment, take like a bachelor, right? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a bachelor? Necessary that it's male, sufficient, I guess, for it to being unmarried. I don't know. I haven't thought through definition of bachelor in much detail, but it's something like that. So that's more of an easy case. But when philosophers talk about any subject, when they write about anything whatsoever, it's extremely important to fix the terms that they're talking about so that
Mhm.
you know, okay, this is what I mean by this thing, because it could be even let's say nominalism.
Mhm.
Like, what do I mean by nominalism? What do I mean by that school of thought?
Yeah.
And one nominalist is going to be very different from another one potentially.
Right.
And you have different versions of nominalism, right? You have ostrich nominalism and
Yeah.
austere nominalism, and those are categorized very differently. Uh, so that's the idea. Is it's just really difficult to pin those sorts of things down.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we got that, and it's so tricky. But moving on to like linguistic entities and
Yeah.
properties. Um, yeah. Can you explain the relationship? What is a linguistic entity? What's a property? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, a linguistic object or entity, you can use either one.
Okay.
Most of the time. I mean, some people have, quirky hangups about different count noun terms like entity or object. But yeah, I think that it's fine to use either one. But a linguistic entity is something like an inscription. It's
Mm.
something like an utterance. It can be something like a proposition if you think those are live objects that you can refer to and use and that are involved in language. They can be like American Sign Language gestures, if you
Oh
want.
yeah. Yeah.
Things, objects that are used in communication and language. That's really it's that broad. And so, I mean, the question is like, how far do you take that? Like, is a stoplight a linguistic entity?
Mm.
Probably not. But again, like these are sort of, as I see it, these are sort of conventions so speaking of pragmatics, I think, if we categorize like a stoplight as a linguistic entity, we'd have to stretch our idea of what actual language is. I think it communicates something. So one of the data points that might be interesting to get at what people talk about in the metaphysics of language is you have all these different sorts of objects, right? If you look at objects in general, you have trees, you have tables, you have chairs, you might have abstract objects that are in that mix. It depends on what like your furniture of the world is.
Yeah.
And included in that, you have these sound waves that we call words and sentences. And then you have like ink markings and pixely things. And those are linguistic entities of some kind. And let's say I say the word stop, and let's say I see the word stop in like pixely language, and then I see a red light in a certain context. And those are extremely different objects.
Yeah.
But for some reason, and this is why people are interested in the topic, they all mean stop. They all
Yeah.
mean the same thing. Whatever that thing is, they all mean the same thing. And that's at least part of that might be an entry point to some people to say, well, what's going on? How can those very, very different things mean the same thing in a certain sense, or do they?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. And those all the pixel, the picture, the actual thing in itself, if we can see the thing in itself, those all are expressing the same univocal meaning of stop, right?
That's the question.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. So the question of meaning is one of the central difficulties, challenges, sort of fun things to explore when it talks about when people talk about linguistic entities. Because on one conception, there are meanings. A word can have several different meanings, and so
Yeah.
we quantify over meanings. And if on some metaphysical conceptions, if you can quantify over something, then that means that it exists in some way.
Right.
So you can go down that road. For people who are strict physicalists,
Hmm.
they don't want to go down that road, obviously, because meanings are not like you can't point to some sort of meaning and go,
Right.
oh, there it is. It's blue and it's got it's not concrete.
Yeah.
And so trying to get around that puzzle, if you're a physicalist, is going to be possibly an issue.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. It's getting spicy. Um,
Yeah.
well, okay, so I'm not sure if I followed the stop light why that wouldn't be an entity. Because doesn't maybe we can get into like tokens and stuff, but is my word for stoplight, is that a linguistic entity?
Yes. Yeah. So the reason that I brought the stoplight in is because it's not that it's not that it's not an entity. It's stretching. So when we think of language,
Yeah.
typically and intuitively, we're not thinking of like light languages, right? Stoplight languages. So
Yeah.
we wouldn't really characterize that as its own language.
Okay.
I
Okay.
mean, you can make an argument that it is and do it that, but the kind of common sense idea of language, ordinary language, let's say,
Yeah.
you wouldn't include a stoplight in. So that's why I brought up that example. That I think, in a very, very broad sense, it's a linguistic entity because it communicates stop or halt or something like that. It really
Oh,
doesn't
okay.
communicate something in English. It's the equivalent in meaning in some way with these English
Yeah.
words and German words and utterances and inscriptions, that sort of thing.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. I have to like pull from what I know, and I studied philosophy of mind for a semester, so I'm like, okay, there's like no, it's observer relative, the stop sign.
Yeah.
It's yeah, based on me seeing that and recognizing that, and I'm probably drawing an analogy between this means stop and like the word stop or my concept of stop. Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So that I mean, you're getting at the heart of, so philosophy of mind is very much involved in philosophy of language issues because if you think that intention with a T,
Mhm.
is involved in language somehow, and everyone recognizes that it is, but
Yeah.
what role does it play? That's really the question that people are asking. Then yeah, philosophy of mind is definitely right at the heart of what's going on with language. Just one more comment on meaning. It
Yeah, please.
comes to mind. So Peirce, back in the early 20th century,
Mhm.
distinguished kinds of signs. And one kind of a sign would be like a symbolic sign. And that would, so the stoplight or even like utterances and inscriptions, those would be symbolic,
Okay.
in that it's this thing that symbolizes this other thing. And
Yeah.
there's the relation. Another category that he proposed that's sort of related is iconic. And so, in that sort of sense, you have a sign where the original is supposed to be similar to like another one. So, like a picture of me, or like, that would represent me or signify me in some way. So, that's another category. And then the third one was indexical. And so, this category is really interesting. I'd actually like to pursue this at some point, but
Mm.
indexical signs are something like a footprint in snow, where you say, "Oh, that footprint means this person walked this way," or here.
Huh.
Or if you think of like circles in a tree, right? You count up the circles, and that means the tree is a certain age, and there's a causal relationship there that's not necessarily there with those other two categories. And the reason I bring that up is because maybe it'll serve our purposes if we have those categories down at some point.
Man, that's so good. Well, the indexical is an interesting one. I always make the God jump too quick, probably, but I'm thinking like you're looking at the rings in a tree, and I don't know how to say it. It's indexical. It stands for the amount of years it's been alive, or it represents that. I don't know. All these
Yeah,
words are loaded.
means it is fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Means that it's this old, but there's no intention with a T unless you're a theist, But there's no intention there, and so it's kind of weird reading that if you don't believe that someone put that there for you to interpret, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, right. Yeah. How to, I think that's right. I mean, I want to say something about meaning and mind dependence, but I don't know if I could sum it up and articulate it in relation to that example, or maybe even in general, because it's such a tricky question.
Yeah.
But if you think about the relation between meaning and mind dependence, it's extremely complex, given the number of various different objects that are out there and the various interpretations that are attached to them,
Yeah.
either actually or possibly.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is one that I did pick up from some apologists, but philosophers too. The it's kind of like the argument from reason, but I think Charles Richard Taylor, one of the Taylors, talked about this white stone analogy. And if you're in a train, you look on this hill and you see spelled out "Welcome to Disney World." There's at least two different ways that happen. One was someone did that with the intention of telling you welcome to, and you could read that if you believe someone did that with an intentional purpose. you could read that for its truth or falsity. Oh no, I'm in Ohio. Or, oh yeah, okay, I'm being welcome in Florida. But if it happened by chance and someone accidentally spilled a bunch of stones, and yeah, the probability is crazy, but it spelled out "Welcome to Disney World," you'd be like foolish to read that for content, because no one's trying to tell you anything. It just happened by chance. And that's kind of what I'm thinking with the rings on the tree.
Yeah. So if you think there's a literature on artifacts. What are artifacts? What makes something an artifact different from like a natural object? And one of the in one paper, I don't even remember what it was, but I give the example of, so I give a couple different examples of how to sort out this complicated question.
Yeah.
And if someone was walking through a forest, again, this is just thought experiment, but if someone was walking through a forest and saw a bunch of sticks on the ground that said help, and for whatever reason, like they know, this is like an abandoned place, like a human didn't do this, would that be the word help? That's one question. And we can kind of zoom out a little bit and say, all right, is that an artifact or not? And compare it to something like this. If you were walking through, a different forest and you came upon like this stump from a tree that had really over time been naturally like whittled into like a stool.
Yeah.
Would that be a stool? And those two questions are very similar, and sorting out the answer yes or no on those couple things is going to be really similar. And the mind independent questions involved with the ontology of those two things, again, are going to be pretty parallel.
Yeah, man, that's good. So going back, just that brought me, dude, we're so far afield from what I told you we were going to talk about. Thanks so much for indulging me on
No,
that.
totally fine.
Yeah. So I'm thinking like the pragmatist in my head. I know a lot of my philosophy friends, when someone brings up like the pragmatic view of truth, they're like, dude, no one believes that actually, and it's kind of a joke. But on the popular level, we got guys like Jordan Peterson who are like, I am a pragmatist, and millions of people are listening to him. And I think of that stool. I wonder if like a pragmatist, whether they exist or not, or whatever, if they're able to exist without performative inconsistency, but he might say, well, it's whatever it is for us. So that's a stool because I see it as a stool, and I'm going to go use it as a stool. That doesn't really have to do much, but I'm just thinking in my head that's the kind of pragmatist I had in mind. Someone who's like, well, everything is just a tool for us. And it kind of goes with evolutionary theory. We've evolved to see things as tools, and so they are what we make them.
Right. Yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated, good issue that you're bringing up. I mean, my thought on so again, the parallels between, language and other objects like the found stool in the forest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some interesting ambiguity there. But so you can, other objects can be used in different ways. And so you can use this sort of thing to sit on. But what happens if, you pick that thing up and there's this thing over there that you have to kind of like hammer. And then, so you use this tool to like hammer in something. Is that thing a hammer?
Right.
It's being used like a hammer. Is it? I don't know. That's still something that I'm sorting out. Is there a fact of the matter whether this is like a stool? Because again, these are objects in the way that we describe them that are human mind dependent artifacts in some way. It's made of wood, right? And so like you want to say that you might want to say that natural objects are not mind dependent, depending on what you're referring to when you talk about natural objects. But yeah, things like stools, tables, chairs, cars, those sorts of things are going to be mind dependent artifacts. And so I don't know if there's a fact of the matter whether this thing over here is like a little tiny cup or whether it's a thimble.
Yeah, dude, that's so good. I hope that the listeners are seeing how cool this is, because like we just have these regular things in our lives, and you see a kid playing with a stick as a gun, and it's like, well, did that become a gun? Like, there's all these questions you can ask about it. I love that. I wanted to get into a little bit more of your stuff, being careful not to name anything here, but so the realism and nominalism debate. Do you call it? Are you a realist concerning linguistic entities?
I think so. I
Okay.
think if you pressed me on the question, I would. Well, let me put it this way. Well, okay, let me back up. So
Yeah.
I've written a few things that are out under review in journals, and so that's the reason I'm not able to name like the title or anything
Right.
like that, because when you submit to an academic philosophical journal, everyone needs to be anonymous, and including the reviewer and myself. And
Yeah.
I think there's just about zero chance of any reviewer listening to anything that I say, but just in principle, trying to keep that,
Yeah. This could
as
blow up, man. We get a million views tomorrow.
yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely. Your listeners will be very disappointed. You had Michael Ray on, so this is going to be quite a disappointment after that.
We'll
But
see.
no, to answer your question, I'm comfortable, I think, with being a realist and saying I do think that things like let me put it this way. We
Mhm.
refer to properties and propositions and abstract entities like numbers all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty comfortable doing that kind of thing. And I think the the arguments that I've seen for not doing that because of any sort of like nominalistic tendency, to me, they don't ring true.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot to try to navigate around those those types of objects. So
Yeah.
at this point, I'm pretty comfortable with abstracta being out there.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So when we say realist, it's a realist concerning abstracta like tables and just like the form of this cup and or cups in general, I guess, right?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean. I mean, that's a question that I am thinking a lot about right now. Like, what kind of object do we refer to when we think of
Ah,
tables? What, like
okay.
the object tables, like the plurality tables, or this table? Again, this is going to seem very pedantic to people, but it's
No,
something
yeah,
that we talk about all the time. That like it would be nice to get clear on in a certain way, so that we can maybe
yeah,
move on to other questions, and other questions might depend on these sorts of things. So that's why
yeah.
we want to sort them out. But yeah, I don't. I feel
I jumped ahead. So I said you're a realist concerning abstracta in general, like cups and stuff. But we were specifically talking about linguistic objects.
yeah. If
Right.
you think so, the concrete abstract distinction, the most like the classic kind of intuitive version is like this cup on my table is a concrete object. Let's
Hmm.
say a
Hmm.
thing like a property or a number is going to be an abstract entity in some way. So
Yeah.
that's the way. Like the number one doesn't have any concrete properties, right? It doesn't smell a certain way,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Smells are actually a really good example when you want to distinguish between concrete and an
Oh,
abstract
okay.
object.
That's good. So like the smell of bacon can only be is that there's no form of that? There's no real thing that is the smell of bacon that is instantiated every time someone cooks bacon?
Well, like the form of bacon would be abstract.
Yeah.
The sort of, and this is where the language gets really tricky.
Yeah.
The whatever the object is that's causing your olfactory senses to activate, then that sort of thing traditionally has been concrete.
Okay. So I'm like, I don't even know how to explain that. I'm like smelled too baconly or something.
On a certain yeah, if you don't want to commit to various metaphysical principles, then sure, you can phrase it that way. I'm very comfortable with saying on some level the bacon smells a certain way, and
Yeah.
I sense the smell.
Okay. Well, there's a problem in philosophy of mind called inverted qualia or inverted spectrum, and it's like we all ask ourselves when we're kids, like, what if your purple is really my yellow?
Right.
And it turns out to be a great argument. Well, I think it's a decent argument against physicalism. You can formulate it that way, but it's a really interesting problem. And I wonder, does that have a cousin or an direct analog in smelling? Like bacon, how do I know what bacon smells like to you, or is that easier to pick out?
I don't know. Yeah, that's a really good question. I definitely have not thought about the fine grain differences between different senses and how
Yeah,
people experience them.
yeah.
Because, yeah, I mean, to my shame, I haven't got a lot into philosophy of mind issues, but I'd be really interested in what people think about that.
Yeah, dude, again, man, I'm stretching you so far, and it's kind of not fair because you're like working on your dissertation and stuff, so you have to be so specified in one area. And I'm like, well, let's go with bacon. Yeah. So I seriously appreciate that. And just so everyone knows, he's so deep. Like a lot of these guys that I have on, especially guys in your position where you guys are working on your dissertation, I know you like hours a day. You're working on one specific thing. So I do appreciate it, man.
No problem. It's all fair game. I mean, if I
Mhm.
don't know something, I'm pretty comfortable saying I
Yeah.
have no idea.
Yeah. That's good.
Smarter people have looked at it, and more power to them.
Yeah. So I wonder if this could be a little bit closer to your wheelhouse. I wanted to talk about like reference to non-existent things, like Samwise Gamgee. Um,
Okay, yeah.
right. So like,
Fictional objects.
is he? Yeah, fictional objects. Is he a? Can you say that he's a linguistic entity? Because like, yeah. What do we make of Samwise Gamgee?
Yeah. All right. So if you Google, uh, I'll say this. So for any listeners out there, if you want to, you know, if you're curious about what the philosophical literature says about something, any topic, then Phil Papers. If you
Hmm.
Google Phil Papers and enter your term in, you may not have access to some articles because a lot of articles are just not open domain. You have to,
Yeah.
like, I get them through A&M's library, and it's a tremendous privilege, and I love it. So just be aware of that limitation. But yeah, if you entered fictional objects into Phil Papers, I don't even know how many papers you would get. It's a huge topic,
Hmm.
and it depends on. So it's a great question, but it depends on what your, at least partially, like what your idea of existence is. Like
Ah,
what kind of notion of existence are you committed to, or do you think is the best option? And where I sit on that, because I'm a realist, I'm very comfortable with saying that abstract objects exist because I don't limit existence to just concrete entities.
yeah.
And so when you're talking about, like, do numbers exist, do propositions exist, those sorts of things, I think we refer to them all the time.
Mhm.
I think that they are objects of some kind. And so when we refer, so I see fictional objects as abstract entities, in some sense. I would qualify that if this was a more like, kind of, if this was like metaphysics podcast and we get into like the fine grained details of abstract objects versus contingently non-concrete objects.
Yeah.
But for our purposes, yeah, I think that sort of thing is like a fictional object. What Sherlock Holmes is mentioned a lot as an
Okay.
example for as a fictional object, and the issues surrounding that involve, like, Sherlock Holmes lived in London,
Hmm.
and London is a real city.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, how do you sort out sentences? So, this is a philosophy of language question. Sherlock Holmes lived in London. And so, you're referring to this abstract entity or this fictional object, and maybe you're committed to that thing being a fictional entity.
Hmm.
And then you're referring to maybe the real London. I'm not sure. And what is London? In one sense, it's sort of like an abstract entity as well. Like, what does London
Yeah.
smell like? Well, it's composed of a lot of different things,
Yeah.
and you can generalize that for material objects as well. Like, my cup is sort of like a London, right? It has different parts, and like they are very different. I'm definitely going down a weird road, a weird metaphysical road at this point.
That's
But
good.
to answer your other question, it's not exactly a linguistic entity. I mean, if I put it in quotes, so I have another paper on quotation where I deal with, like, what's going on with quotation. It's this very weird phenomena.
Hmm.
But if I put Sherlock Holmes in quotes, like, that would be a linguistic entity.
Okay.
Um, that's how I would maybe begin to sort those things out.
Okay. Yeah, that's so good. Uh, I've talked with some metaphysicians and about Samwise specifically. I don't know why I
Uh-huh.
always go to Samwise, but
Yeah,
uh,
great.
some have said that Tolkien just he picked out a possible world, and it's like, well, not to diminish his creativity, but he kind of like discovered a possible world, which is Middle Earth. And since there's this vast number of possible worlds, there is a possible world that is Middle Earth, and as long as there's no like contradictions in it or something. I don't know. But
Yeah.
is so would you think of it that way? Like is Samwise Gamgee I guess your view on fictional characters. Maybe you haven't thought through that a ton, but
A little bit, yeah. All right. So my view. Let me try to mark out the terrain a little bit
yeah,
and see
please.
if I come down on something. So yeah, there is a school of thought that identifies fictional worlds with possible worlds, or at least segments of possible worlds, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so if you have, let me try not to get ahead of myself. What is a possible world? And what is possibility? That's one question. And there's a difference between modeling a possible world in set theoretic terms, so that it's just this like stack of propositions,
Mm-hmm.
an infinite stack of propositions, and then so there's a possible world where all of these propositions are true, and then there's another possible world where all of these can be whatever you want. All of these are false, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's just an uncountably infinite number of worlds in between that.
Yeah.
And so that's one conception of possible worlds, is just a lot of propositions that have true and false values that are different, and the difference demarcates one possible world from another. There's also metaphysical possibility,
Mm.
right? So so logical possibility is like the most broad kind of possibility, and then there's metaphysical possibility. And
Yeah.
metaphysical possibility is sort of, you might think of it as, could this possible world W actually be actualized? Like, could it become concrete
Yeah.
theoretically? And that sort of intuitively gets at the notion of a metaphysically possible world. Why do I say all this? Well, different fictions, like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, maybe that reflects some sort of segment of some possible world out there. Maybe even a metaphysically possible world, depending on what's going on in there.
Mm.
There are also impossible worlds. That's a whole field too,
Yeah.
where a couple propositions within a possible world can contradict each other, whether that's acceptable. So some people think impossible worlds are a live option to believe in, and other people don't. And then within whatever fictional world that might be a possible world, you
Mm-hmm.
have fictional entities like Samwise,
Yeah.
and so that's sort of where I think I'm at, where is identifying fictional worlds with possible worlds of some kind. One philosopher who I think has an incredible understanding of this sort of thing, and I think is unbelievably brilliant, is Ed Zalta. He's done a
Okay.
lot of work on fictional objects, and his work is just in a different stratosphere. He's just
Hmm.
an incredible philosopher. He's just in the elite category. But he actually has worked all this out formally. And so he defines a situation, he defines a possible world in terms of a situation, he defines a story. So there can be abstract objects or fictional objects within what he defines as a story. And
Huh.
so a story is sort of like this, as I remember, it's almost like a subset of a possible world, where you can have objects and different scenarios and situations occur within a story.
Interesting.
So that's a really complex answer to your question, but it alludes to
Hmm.
a really complex literature on the topic, because these issues are really difficult to sort through, especially when you're trying to combine fictional objects and real world objects, and what does that
Yeah.
look like?
Yeah. Well, and it comes up for me. It's kind of random, but it comes up for me because I was pretty committed to like the Straussonian presupposition and failure of Bos van Frossen, and I'm sure you probably know like Don Collette and his view of tag. He uses Van Frossen's interpretation of Straussonian presuppositions to say, the King of France is bald. Well, that's neither true nor false, because it's a failure of presupposition, because there is no King of France. And so I thought, that's pretty knocked down. I like that, and maybe that's how we can draw out Van Til's tag. But then I thought about Samwise, and I'm like, well, Samwise Gamgee has red hair or is brave. And it's like, well,
Right.
there is no Samwise Gamgee. But so then we go to fictional characters, and I'm sure there's probably a distinction between like fictional characters and the story that you're bringing up versus like just a false statement, like there is a King of France, or if that is false. But it's so tricky. You get into all this craziness.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I haven't looked at the theory that you're talking about. You know, if you say that a certain proposition is neither true or false, then you're committed to a particular view of logic that's going to be
Yeah.
non-classical, and so that, which may be fine, but it would be a an important commitment to make or to state,
Yeah.
because it has other implications for the kind of logic that you're going
Yeah.
to be utilizing throughout the
Because
paper.
that I think that it commits. I think Van Frosten at least is committed to saying just a failure of bivalence. That's okay. And if you like
Okay.
classical logic, you want to say no, it doesn't fail. And I think what some folks have done is said, well, it's nonsense. It's not actually, so it's neither true nor false, and it's nonsense. And since it's nonsense, it's not actually a proposition. And since bivalence has to do with propositions, it doesn't matter if there's nonsense. Is that a fair move? Do you think, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't. It depends on which move in the air that you're talking about. I mean, the way that I understand like the Samwise question, uh, because I think in one sense that referring to the abstract object of the fictional object of Samwise, then there isn't reference failure there when we talk about that sort of thing.
Okay.
And so you can say, and this is what Zalta does. You can say that you know, a certain proposition referring to this object is true or false. Now,
Yeah.
picking out the exact abstract object, that like there's a recognition that it's probably like a family of abstract objects, because think of it this way: Spider-Man,
Hmm.
Peter Parker. Think of how many different iterations
Yeah.
Peter Parker has been represented by in terms of just the storytelling, different ethnicities, different ages, different, you know, people representing that sort of thing. Like you have the comics, you have the movies,
Yeah.
you have all sorts of different kinds of, and you know, on a view that's sympathetic to abstract realism, all those sorts of things refer to different abstract objects of some kind and have different properties, and those are different stories and ones, but they can be very similar to each other. And so
Yeah.
working that out would be really complex, but
Yeah.
that may be one line of pursuit there.
That's so cool too. And if any like the comic nerds out there are like, no, I actually didn't like this iteration of Spider-Man, pick that up and argue it and argue why he's not a proper instantiation of, Peter Parker or something. That'd be good. I'd love to read
Right.
that. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Or
Jared,
Batman, you know, any of the Batman
yeah,
movies.
seriously. Yeah, that's a big one. Uh,
Yeah.
do you have a little bit of time to go into over like Lucy the Spider, or should we not talk about that?
Yeah, I can maybe generalize from the argument that you're referring to.
Yeah, just like a challenge, maybe a challenge for nominalists, conceptions of properties and stuff like that.
Yeah, good. Okay, so what you're referring to is an argument that is in another paper. I forget which journal, but again, just stepping back a little bit, the one challenge for nominalism uh, is that in ordinary talk, like we said in this podcast, we're constantly referring to things that look like they're properties,
Hmm.
look like they're abstract objects of some kind. And remember that nominalism doesn't like abstract objects.
Right.
And so one of the nominalist challenges is to try to come up with sentences that are equivalent in meaning that paraphrase the abstract objects away.
Yeah.
And so one of the papers that I wrote, and that's under review, is dealing with one attempt to paraphrase sentences that look like they are referring to properties in a way the paraphrase might be nominally acceptable,
Hmm.
nominalistically acceptable. And so I know this is so I'm not explaining it as well as I could, but the idea is that we talk about things. Let's put it this way: we talk about things like numbers. Numbers look like they're abstract. We
Yeah.
talk about something having the property of being two-legged, right? Bipedal humans,
Hmm.
and those properties are like just don't exist for a nominalist. And
Jared is having a little bit of connection problem, I think. Hopefully he'll come back here. He was just talking about bipeds and the problem of nominalism, what we would say the problem is. Jared, you back?
I'm back now.
There we go. Sweet.
There was a glitch.
Yeah.
So I don't know the last thing that you heard.
So you're talking about bipeds, and you're just kind of setting out the nominalist goal, like what they're trying to do to get rid of abstracta.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So a lot of times in our language, ordinary language, even philosophical language, it looks like in order for us to express ourselves, we need to refer to abstract objects on some level, numbers, properties, that sort of thing. And there have been attempts to say, well, actually, we can paraphrase those things away so that we can have sentences that are equivalent in meaning that don't commit us to those sorts of entities. So I challenge that on a couple different levels. One, I don't think that you can get from some concrete entity to meaning in general, and something that has meaning. So that's sort of like the nexus of the metaphysical and linguistic question right there.
Yeah. Man, that's huge. So let's go over it one more time for the listeners, maybe for myself as well. So a realist says, "Hey, look, well, maybe we want to stick to linguistics." So like I write a sentence. The cat is on the mat. I hate that one because everyone uses that, but it comes up. The cat is on the mat. I write that, and you write that. It's both expressing the same thing. So a realist would go, yeah, it's expressing the proposition that the cat is on the mat. And you could say that in Spanish. You could have all different sentence tokens. Is that right?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Everything has qualifications. So a nominalist doesn't want that third thing. They don't want that proposition out there floating around. They say, no, I always think of Aristotle, like there's no uninstantiated forms. Even that though, you're having instantiated forms, but there's no abstract entity that is that proposition. And so they're trying to get around that. And then are you able to explain like what's maybe one of the problems that you say you can't, here's why you can't do that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain, but like the question is like where. Okay, let me put it this way. Taking a look at a couple like data points, and so let's say the entity that is DIE, that entity, in English it's die.
Mm-hmm.
In German it's D. It's an article. It doesn't mean at all the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that's a very simple illustration to say you can't look at the physical properties of some sort of linguistic expression to say, oh, that means whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's the meaning has got to come from some other source. It's not intrinsic to that metaphysical object itself, coming from some extrinsic source. And there are various ways of explaining that. But the nominalist challenge is, where is it coming from? What's the relationship between those two? And if you're dealing with relations, relations are not exactly nominalistically acceptable in some accounts either. And so it's very hard to say, let's paint a conception of language and how it works that's nominalistically acceptable, that only deals with concrete entities. Let's take that DIE example, and that means, well, it's got to be some other concrete entity. But what concrete entity would that be? Is it something in your mind? Well, I don't have access to like a concrete entity in your mind. I can't see how it would mean that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is it like this event in the world? Well, it can't be that either. So trying to narrow down this concrete relation of some kind between the representation and what is represented, that's really where I poke at and go, I don't think that there are really any viable concrete candidates to say, oh, this is what the concrete meaning could be.
Yeah. Dude, that's great. I really like that a lot. Yeah. I mean, I read the paper, but now hearing you say it is really helpful as well, just kind of metabolizing it. So someone might say, well, die in the German language game, you have to know the language game. You have to be associated with that language game, whatever. And
Yeah,
likewise with the American one, and then even within the American one, you'd have to be associated with the gambling language game, if that is referring to that, or
yeah,
death or whatever more generally. And then so you might push back and say, yeah, but what is that language? Like, where is that
that's
language
it.
game, right? Like, where is it an abstract? Because then you're not a nominalist. Is it just, yeah, where would that language be even if you're a nominalist?
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, it's really important to distinguish like the metaphysical questions that we're asking and then the philosophy of language questions that
Ah,
we're asking on the other hand.
yeah.
And so if we're starting out going, what are the objects involved with language?
Uh-huh.
And then we end up explaining it by some sort of like philosophical or philosophy of language principle, like a language game. That's sort of changing the question a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's how I would respond to something like that. Is like you're no, I'm interested in objects. I'm interested in the metaphysics here of what's going on. If you're saying that only concrete things exist, then reference to like a language game is not going to do much work for you in pinning down, because then you have to explain, okay, so I guess a language game is only concrete. Now
Yeah.
tell me the metaphysics of a language game.
Yes. Right. Yeah. They just inherit the problem again.
Yeah.
That's sweet. I love it. That's so good. I'm getting all
Yeah.
fired up. Yeah. For the
Yeah. listeners,
Jared, I don't know if you'd endorse this or not, but I've been reading William Lycan's Philosophy of Language. It's a Routledge modern or contemporary introduction. I love it. It's been really good.
Yeah, that's a great choice. I did a couple philosophy of language independent studies with a professor here named Michael Hand, who's just beyond brilliant. He studied it under Jaakko Hintikka,
Hmm.
one of the founders of modal logic. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah. And when he was recommending various works, if you want like kind of a one-stop shop for philosophy of language, and you'll get into other issues as well, but like just a starting point, that's what he recommended as well. So I
Oh,
think
wow.
you have a
Okay.
good one there.
Oh, that's great. Jared, in closing up, I wonder this. I hope this will be quick. Um, some people, I like logic. I want to get into logic more. I just want to be that kind of guy who studies logic. And then,
Yeah.
actually, one of your tweets, you tweeted out about Gödel, and you said how he was like one of the if not the best, like or most influential philosopher of the 20th century, something like that. Does that sound right? Does that you said something like that, right?
Yeah, I forget what I said. I think it was here's what I do think.
Yeah.
Whether I misstated in a tweet or not, or
Yeah.
how tweets can be. But
Right. Right. Totally.
from so I'm not a girdle expert by any
Right.
stretch.
Sure.
But what has been communicated and passed down to me is Girl did about five things, only one of which would have put him in the upper
Right.
echelon pantheon of logicians.
Yeah.
And to do, the five, so yeah, things involved with like completeness, incompleteness, all those proofs that he did, and other things that I'm sure I don't even have the capacity to understand. And that just puts him at just there are only a handful of people who have done that sort of thing. Now the everyday person is probably doesn't know who that is, and
Right.
so influence can be really tricky
Mhm.
to track and to measure in that sort of way. But in terms of how his work has influenced work after him, it's been, at least in analytic philosophy, just incredibly systemic. And again, from what I hear, the reverberations of his work have been equivalent to Aristotle in some ways. Like his mind was just so expansive. He was just so creative in so many ways
Yeah.
that's really kind of the only thing that you can compare him to, is just
Yeah.
this brilliant creative mind that just blew up an entire field.
Yeah. Yeah, the dude's amazing. So because you said that, I looked into Gödel some more. I read a biography, which was awesome. He really tragic life, but
Yeah.
so I got in because of that. I said, well, now I want to study some mathematics or philosophy of math, right? And I'm just trying to think. I don't want to be reductionistic because I know I don't want to reduce math to logic because that's logicism. It seems like that's been debunked, though now there's some like neo logicists. But then we got language in there too, and you could say, well, like the number one is a linguistic entity, maybe. Or you might say that. Is there a relation? Do you have a conception of the relation between like logic, math, and language? Are they all equally ultimate, or is one more foundational than the other? I know that's a tricky question. It's really abstract, but
Yeah, that's $1 million question in philosophy.
yeah.
I don't. Let's see. So the three things. Let's see: mathematics, logic, and language.
Yeah, so some people will teach logic, um, like couched in language. I think there was this Oxford course that was free online, and a lot of I think maybe Vern Poitras kind of goes this route a little bit of logic is like a subset of language. He's maybe too tri perspectival to say that, but and then other people I think go like with the logic route and just trying to I don't know what to make sense. I know very few people have like a this is what's up, and if they do, they get debunked. But you just your own conception, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's. I don't think anything that I say will be that controversial, but here's how I might like triangulate a couple of those things.
Yeah.
That you have ordinary language,
Hmm.
and then you have formal languages, right? So you have like propositional logic,
Yep.
and at least mathematically and logically, you start out by saying here's the language and this
Hmm.
is what it looks like, and you define things. You say we can have propositional variables. Here are going to be the operators like negation and or. Those are going to be the fixed operators that operate on various propositions within propositional logic.
Right.
And so there's going to be like your language, and that's going to be this contained in a way thing. And then
Hmm.
you also have another formal language like the predicate calculus or predicate logic,
Yeah.
and that's going to build a little bit on propositional, but it's going to have quantifiers, and it's going to treat operations a little bit differently in the syntax and the rules, um, and and then you have just like a ton of other logical languages as well that
Yeah.
all are defined in a certain way, and they're defined and worked out sometimes in mathematical set theoretic ways.
Yeah.
And so you have things like predicates which express properties, and properties are basically sets of objects. And so the
Mm.
property of being blue, the property of blue is just all the objects that instantiate the property of being blue. And so you
Yeah.
have like all your like furniture of the world, right? All your basically elements, all your objects down here, and then the property of blue just says it's this kind of function that says, all right, grab me all the blue things that are in that level. And then
Yeah.
that's a property, and that's expressed in set theoretic terms. That doesn't totally capture what we think properties are, but
Hmm.
again, it mathematically, set theoretically expresses a part of what we're trying to get at when we talk about properties. And
Yeah.
so mathematics and I mean, set theory is sort of like the bedrock foundation of much of mathematics and logic. And
Yeah.
that's maybe how I would start to see those different things. So you have ordinary language, formal languages, and in the formal language category, I mean, logic is the study of logical consequence. What follows from what?
Hmm.
And then that sounds very easy or whatever, but then seeing that as just where the logical explosion comes from and how to
Hmm.
symbolize these things, and they can be expressed in mathematical ways that make it extremely precise.
Yeah. Okay. Man, that's so good. Yeah, again, thanks for indulging me on all this stuff. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, I geek out. I like talking about it.
Yeah, this was awesome. So this is the first hopefully of several more. I know you're going to be writing your stuff and busy, but I'd love to get you back on, pump you for more information. Thanks so much for being such a good sport with us and seriously helping me level up. And I know our listeners are going to love that too. Actually, Jared, where can people find you? So I said Twitter because I've followed you for a couple of years, and there's so many books that you'll post, and when one's interesting, I just grab them. So go find Jared on Twitter. Is there anything else you'd like to plug, and website or anything?
Good question. Thanks. Yeah. And my Twitter engagement has been down quite a bit since I've
Makes
started
sense,
the PhD,
right?
but so fair warning. The only other thing that I can think of is if you're interested in some logical questions, I have done a couple like logical problems on my YouTube channel.
Hmm.
If you search language proof and logic or like LPL, you'll see those worked out. I bet maybe 0 people will be interested in that sort of thing, but some student, because it's a textbook that gets used at different colleges and in different kinds of ways, then maybe that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
That's the only other thing that I can think of.
Yeah.
Every once in a while I write on Medium, but that's few and far between too.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up. How you post this on Twitter, right? If someone followed you on Twitter, they can find your Medium posts.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Because some of those are really, really helpful. You did one kind of a takedown of someone who was using some kind of logic. I don't remember the exact language, but that was super bomb. I love that. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been Parker's Pensies. We can talk about this more. Lord willing, we will. But for now, it's going to have to do it. As always, all glory to God.